In today's stories, we examine the most stupid birthday party deaths ever. From a store worker who turned a cheap party horn into a lethal weapon, to an office administrator whose birthday cake challenge would become his final bite, all because showing off went horribly wrong. It was March 15, 2016 in Columbus, Ohio. A community gathering space buzzed with activity as co-workers assembled for Janet's 30th birthday celebration. Folding tables lined the walls, covered with plastic tablecloths and paper plates. The smell of pizza mixed with laughter echoing off concrete walls. Trevor Mansfield arrived fashionably late, as usual. At 27, he worked 6 days a week at an electronics store, surrounded by gadgets and accessories. Those who worked with him described him as loud, attention-seeking, and prone to dismissing warning labels as unnecessary and exaggerated. Trevor's reckless behavior wasn't limited to work. He'd previously been banned from 2 different bars for bringing modified electronic devices that created excessive noise or flashing lights. His apartment was filled with jury-rigged gadgets that combined multiple products in ways they were never intended to function. Trevor took pride in these creations, viewing himself as an innovator who saw beyond manufacturer limitations. That evening, Trevor arrived carrying a plastic bag filled with party horns taken from the novelty section of the electronics store where he worked. Modifying consumer products was something he did regularly, often treating warning labels as suggestions rather than rules. Earlier that day, using his employee discount, he had also purchased a canister of compressed air intended for cleaning keyboards and electronics. During his lunch break, he had rigged a way to force the compressed air through the party horns to increase their volume. When Trevor entered the gathering space, he removed the modified device from the bag. It consisted of a standard plastic party horn with the compressed air canister duct taped to its side and connected by a narrow plastic tube. The unusual setup immediately drew attention from those nearby as he moved through the room. Trevor began activating the device by depressing the trigger on the compressed air canister while blowing into the horn. The resulting noise was extremely loud, reverberating off the concrete walls and startling people nearby. Several attendees reacted by covering their ears and moving away from the sound. Rather than stopping, Trevor continued triggering short blasts from the horn throughout the celebration. Each burst disrupted conversations and caused people to distance themselves from him. Over time, the compressed air canister began to lose pressure, reducing the intensity of the sound. In an attempt to force out the remaining contents, Trevor adjusted the canister, tilting it at a steep angle. Compressed air dusters are designed to be used upright, and altering their position can cause liquid propellant to be released instead of compressed gas. Trevor did not appear to account for this as he continued manipulating the device. With the horn positioned close to his mouth, Trevor depressed the trigger again while the canister was nearly inverted. Instead of releasing air, a concentrated stream of liquid difluoroethane was expelled through the tube and into his mouth and upper airway. Witnesses reported that Trevor immediately recoiled and dropped the device. He began coughing forcefully and clutching his chest and throat as he staggered backward. The inhaled chemical caused severe irritation to his airway and lungs, triggering rapid breathing difficulty and intense distress. Within moments, Trevor's movements became unsteady. Witnesses reported that he became disoriented and collapsed onto the floor as his breathing worsened. Attendees nearby attempted to assist him while emergency services were contacted. Despite these efforts, his condition continued to deteriorate. Trevor lost consciousness before paramedics arrived. Attempts to revive him were unsuccessful. The medical examiner later determined that Trevor died from a sudden cardiac arrhythmia and respiratory failure caused by inhalation of difluoroethane propellant. Investigators noted that the compressed air canister carried multiple warning labels explicitly advising against inhalation and improper positioning. The incident was ruled accidental, caused by the victim's unsafe modification of consumer products and deliberate disregard for clearly stated safety instructions. Trevor's defiance of safety warnings had turned a simple party horn into a deadly weapon. But in Texas, a security guard was about to discover that childhood games could be just as lethal when adult pride took control. It was August 3rd, 2017, in Austin, Texas. A backyard party was in full swing behind a modest ranch house. String lights hung between oak trees, and a concrete patio was crowded with folding chairs arranged in a circle as the sun set. Kenneth Briggs had been looking forward to this party all week. At 33, Kenneth worked as a security guard at a shopping center, spending 8-hour shifts on his feet, watching for shoplifters and handling minor disturbances. His job required patience and restraint, but Kenneth's personality was the opposite. He was intensely competitive about everything, from parking spaces to restaurant service. Kenneth's co-workers knew him as someone who couldn't handle losing. During break room card games, he'd been caught cheating multiple times. At company picnics, he argued with anyone acting as referee and had once pushed a child aside during a 3-legged race because the kid was blocking his path. Kenneth saw every activity as a contest he needed to win. When the host announced musical chairs, Kenneth immediately perked up. He'd been drinking beer steadily for 2 hours and felt confident about his chances. 13 adults agreed to play, which meant 12 chairs for the first round. Kenneth studied the setup like a general planning a battle, noting which chairs were sturdiest and had the best approach angles. The music started and everyone began walking around the circle. Kenneth stayed close to the chairs, barely moving in the required direction. When the music stopped for the first elimination, Kenneth quickly claimed a seat while a woman in her 40s was left standing. He celebrated loudly, pumping his fist and drawing attention to himself. The second round began with 11 people and 10 chairs. Kenneth positioned himself strategically, keeping one hand near a chair back as they walked. When the music stopped, he shoved a woman aside to claim the seat, causing a brief argument. Other players reacted negatively as he shoved past them, but Kenneth continued celebrating and drawing attention to himself. By the third round, Kenneth was visibly agitated. As the game continued, his behavior became increasingly aggressive and reckless. With 9 people competing for 8 chairs, Kenneth decided to position himself between 2 chairs to guarantee success. He'd grab whichever one was closer when the music stopped. The music played for about 30 seconds before cutting off abruptly. Kenneth saw his target chair, but another player was also moving toward it. Instead of simply walking over, Kenneth decided to dive. He wanted to make sure he got there first, and a dramatic leap would also show everyone how committed he was to winning. Kenneth launched himself forward from several feet away, aiming to land in the chair ahead of his competitor, but he miscalculated both the distance and his trajectory. Instead of landing in the seat, Kenneth flew past the chair entirely and hit the concrete patio head first. The impact was devastating. Kenneth's head struck the concrete at a severe angle, causing catastrophic injuries to his head and neck. Kenneth's body went immediately limp, his legs twisted underneath him in an unnatural position. The other players froze as Kenneth lay motionless on the concrete, his eyes open but unfocused and his breathing shallow. He showed no signs of consciousness or voluntary movement. Responders later noted that the position of his neck suggested severe traumatic injury. He was later pronounced dead. The medical examiner determined that blunt force trauma from the head-first fall caused fatal respiratory failure. The death was ruled accidental, with investigators concluding that alcohol impairment and reckless behavior during a party game directly caused the fatal head-first fall. The party ended immediately as guests cleared the yard and emergency crews secured the scene. What had begun as a casual birthday gathering was abruptly cut short, leaving the backyard silent as investigators documented the incident, and the home was returned to the host later that night. Kenneth's competitive nature had transformed innocent fun into a fatal miscalculation on that Austin patio. Meanwhile, in California, a weekend DIY enthusiast was putting the finishing touches on a homemade device that would soon prove far more dangerous than any party game. It was November 22, 2015 in San Diego, California. A suburban garage had been converted into a party space for the evening, with cars moved to the driveway and folding tables set up between tool benches. The concrete floor was swept clean, and extension cords ran power to string lights hung from the rafters. Douglas Kramer was proud of his latest project. At 41, Douglas worked as an accountant during the week, but weekends belonged to his DIY hobby. He spent hours watching YouTube tutorials and had convinced himself he could build anything with enough research and determination. His garage was filled with half-finished projects and modified tools that he'd improved beyond their original specifications. Douglas had a dangerous habit of ignoring instruction manuals and safety equipment. He considered warning labels to be suggestions rather than requirements, often telling friends that manufacturers just wanted to cover themselves legally. This attitude had led to several minor accidents over the years, but Douglas always blamed the tools rather than his modifications. For this party, Douglas had built what he called a confetti cannon using PVC pipe and parts from his air compressor. The design was loosely based on a YouTube video, but Douglas had made several modifications to increase the power and visual impact. He'd used a larger diameter pipe and removed the safety valve that was supposed to prevent overpressurization. The PVC pipe was not rated for compressed air use or the pressure levels Douglas was applying, but he had tested his version at 120 psi because he wanted maximum effect. He'd convinced himself that safety margins were built in for legal protection, not real-world limitations. He'd filled the cannon with glitter, confetti, and small plastic pieces to create a high-impact confetti effect for the party. Several guests had expressed concern about the device when Douglas showed it off earlier. The pressure gauge was clearly reading well above normal ranges, and the PVC connections looked stressed under the load. Douglas dismissed their concerns and continued preparing the device. Douglas had positioned the cannon near the birthday cake table for maximum dramatic effect. His plan was to trigger it during the cake-cutting ceremony, showering the area with colorful confetti. He'd spent 20 minutes adjusting the angle and pressure, carefully positioning the device near the cake table. The accident happened when Douglas decided to make one final adjustment. He noticed the pressure had dropped slightly and wanted to bring it back to maximum levels. Instead of using the proper controls, Douglas decided to manually check the main connection point where the air compressor attached to his modified PVC system. Douglas leaned directly over the cannon, positioning his face just inches from the overpressurized joint. As he reached to tighten the connection with his bare hands, the PVC fitting failed catastrophically. The pipe joint separated under pressure, and the sudden release created a violent whiplash effect. The loose section of PVC pipe, still under tremendous pressure, whipped upward like a released spring. The heavy pipe struck Douglas directly in the temple, with the full force of the pressure release behind it. The impact delivered a concentrated high-energy blow to the side of his head. Douglas collapsed immediately after the impact, blood visible at the site of the head injury. He convulsed briefly on the garage floor, surrounded by the scattered confetti and glitter that sprayed everywhere when the system failed. Witnesses described Douglas lying motionless among the party supplies while the air compressor continued running, hissing loudly through the destroyed connections. His breathing became irregular and shallow following the traumatic impact. Douglas never regained consciousness. He was later pronounced dead. The medical examiner determined that he died from severe traumatic brain injury caused by blunt force impact from the pressurized pipe. The death was classified as accidental, with investigators citing improper modification of pressure equipment, removal of safety devices, and failure to follow basic safety protocols as the direct causes of the fatal accident. Douglas's engineering overconfidence had filled a San Diego garage with deadly shrapnel and scattered dreams. But on a Florida beach, an experienced bartender was preparing to demonstrate his drinking prowess in a challenge that would push his body far beyond its breaking point. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We analyze incidents like these every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next. It was July 14th, 2018 in Panama City Beach, Florida. A beach house rental was winding down from a day-long birthday celebration. The living room overlooked the Gulf of Mexico, with sliding glass doors open to let in the ocean breeze. Empty beer bottles and plastic cups covered every surface, and a large punch bowl on the kitchen counter still contained about 2 gallons of heavily spiked fruit punch. Ryan Dalton had been bartending at a resort establishment for 3 years, and he prided himself on his alcohol tolerance. At 29, Ryan drank heavily after most shifts, often finishing customers' leftover drinks and occasionally taking bottles from work. He constantly bragged about being able to handle liquor better than anyone and had never backed down from a drinking challenge. Ryan's coworkers knew him as someone who boasted about his drinking capacity at every opportunity. He'd tell stories about consuming massive amounts of alcohol without getting sick, and he treated every social gathering as a chance to prove his superiority. Ryan genuinely believed his bartending experience had given him special knowledge about alcohol that others lacked. Around 11 p.m., most guests had either left or were preparing to leave. The party was clearly over, but the large punch bowl remained nearly full. The punch bowl contained mostly rum and vodka with very little mixer, explaining why so few people had been drinking it throughout the day. The alcohol content was obviously high. You could smell the liquor from several feet away. Ryan saw an opportunity to end the party with a memorable demonstration. Ryan decided to attempt finishing the entire bowl as a demonstration of his alcohol tolerance. Other guests initially thought he was joking, but Ryan was completely serious. As others realized he was serious, the situation escalated into a self-imposed drinking challenge. Ryan examined the punch bowl and estimated it contained about 2 gallons of liquid. He was calculating based on beer consumption, not realizing that the punch contained the equivalent of dozens of standard shots of hard liquor. The fruit juice and sugar masked the alcohol content, making it taste much weaker than it actually was. Ryan began drinking directly from the ladle, treating the challenge like a competition. He consumed the punch steadily, pausing only to catch his breath between large gulps. Other guests watched with a mixture of amusement and concern as Ryan worked his way through the bowl. The effects of the alcohol became rapidly apparent. Within a short period, he had consumed well over a gallon of the heavily spiked punch. The alcohol concentration in his bloodstream was rising rapidly, but Ryan's competitive nature kept him drinking even as he began to feel disoriented. As Ryan continued drinking, his movements became increasingly unsteady. He had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to maintain his balance while ladling more punch into his mouth. As the alcohol took hold, Ryan became visibly unsteady, gripping the counter for balance and slurring his words as he continued drinking. Guests noticed he was pale, sweaty, and struggling to focus, but he dismissed their concerns and sat heavily in a chair as his condition continued to worsen. Within minutes, Ryan's condition deteriorated rapidly. His eyes rolled back, his breathing became shallow and irregular, and he vomited before going limp in the chair. Guests were unable to wake him and noticed his pulse was weak as his breathing grew barely detectable. The medical examiner later determined that acute alcohol poisoning caused central nervous system depression, leading to respiratory failure. He lost consciousness before medical help could arrive and was later pronounced dead. Investigators ruled the death accidental, citing voluntary consumption during a self-imposed drinking challenge. Ryan's bartending experience had failed him catastrophically in that beachside test of endurance. Back in Michigan, an office administrator was eyeing a birthday cake that would become the instrument of his own suffocation. It was September 8th, 2016 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. A private party room at a family restaurant was decorated with balloons and streamers for a coworker's birthday celebration. Round tables filled the space, each covered with checkered tablecloths and paper napkins. The birthday cake sat on a corner table, a large sheet cake with thick layers and heavy buttercream frosting. Mitchell Torres had a reputation for eating quickly. At 35, Mitchell worked as an office administrator, usually eating lunch at his desk while continuing to work. His co-workers often joked about how fast he could finish a meal, and Mitchell took pride in his speed-eating abilities. He was competitive about trivial things and never admitted defeat, even when the stakes were meaningless. Mitchell had several annoying habits that his co-workers tolerated but didn't appreciate. He would start eating contests that nobody else wanted to participate in, and he always took large portions before others had a chance to serve themselves. Mitchell saw every meal as an opportunity to prove something, though nobody was quite sure what he was trying to demonstrate. When the birthday cake was cut, the pieces were generous, roughly 4-inch squares with thick frosting between the layers. The cake was clearly rich and dense, the kind that most people would eat slowly to avoid feeling sick. Mitchell appeared focused on drawing attention to himself at the table. Mitchell picked up his piece and indicated that he intended to eat it in a single bite. The other people at his table laughed, thinking he was kidding, but Mitchell was completely serious. When they realized he meant it, they began encouraging him, turning his joke into an impromptu eating challenge. Mitchell examined his cake piece carefully, turning it around to find the best angle of approach. The piece was obviously too large for a normal bite, but Mitchell convinced himself it was manageable. The cake had dense layers with heavy buttercream frosting between each section, making it even more substantial than it appeared. Mitchell opened his mouth as wide as possible and positioned the entire piece for insertion. He had to compress the cake slightly to fit it past his teeth, but he was determined to prove his point. The frosting began sticking to his lips and the roof of his mouth as he forced the cake inside. Once the entire piece was forced into his mouth, the obstruction became apparent. The cake lodged in his airway, rapidly restricting airflow, and the dense frosting and compressed cake made the obstruction difficult to dislodge. The dense cake absorbed saliva and worsened the airway obstruction. Mitchell began choking violently, grabbing at his throat and struggling silently as he tried to breathe. His face turned red almost immediately as he struggled to breathe. The cake mass was too large and sticky to remove, and Mitchell's panic made the situation worse as he used up his remaining oxygen. At first, some coworkers laughed, believing he was exaggerating his attempt. Within seconds, Mitchell's face began changing color, and he dropped to his knees beside his chair while clutching at his throat. The dense cake mass was visible in his mouth and difficult to dislodge, with the compressed frosting and crumbs continuing to severely restrict airflow. Several people tried to help Mitchell remove the food, but the buttercream frosting made it impossible to get a grip on the cake mass. Someone attempted abdominal thrusts, but efforts to expel the obstruction were unsuccessful. Mitchell's struggles became weaker as oxygen deprivation took effect. Mitchell lost consciousness within minutes as the obstruction persisted. Oxygen deprivation quickly took effect as the obstruction remained in place, and his body went limp as he collapsed fully to the floor. Despite continued efforts to help him, the food obstruction was too severe to overcome. Mitchell later died from asphyxia caused by food airway obstruction. Emergency personnel arrived within 8 minutes and initiated advanced airway management, but resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. The death was ruled accidental choking, and the restaurant implemented a policy banning eating contests after the incident. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.